Tonight I want to talk about limits. Now, there's a lot of things that I'm very unsure of, but this is one of the few things that I can say with a certain degree of confidence. The vast majority of people are living well within their limitations. So the question is, how do we end up reaching our limitations? And I think one of the best answers is, well, you're never going to be able to find your limitations unless you push yourself to them. And that's great and all, but it seems like a rather difficult task, if not insurmountable. So how do we make this task a little easier? And I think one of the better ways of doing it is to approach limitations with two different categories. I want to talk about physical limitations, and I want to talk about mental limitations. Now, with physical limitations, I think that there's two things I want to talk about within that category, and that's going to be your body and the physical limitations of the artistic medium. Now, it's fairly obvious that your body has limitations. You can only jump so high and run so fast. Your ears can only hear so much. About 20 to 20,000 hertz. And your eyes can only see so much. And that's about something in the area of 380 nanometers to 720 nanometers within the electromagnetic spectrum. And all of the various sonic and electromagnetic realities existing outside this very, very small, minuscule range, we're completely blind and deaf to. It's almost similar to that of a TV station or a TV receiver, with all of these different frequencies of channels all out in the air, and you're only capable of picking up one or two of them, and there may be thousands of them, completely outside of the range of your ability to receive them. So there's a lot of information that we're missing out on. In fact, it's a remarkable amount of information. If we were to arbitrarily divide the electromagnetic spectrum into 60 octaves, you're capable of seeing one octave. So you're incredibly limited for your body. And there's also limitations within the artistic medium. If you're a sculptor, you're limited by the amount of material that you have. If you're a painter, well, you can only have so many different colors that you can go between. Music, you're limited by the physics of sound. So there's those two different types of limitations within that context. Now, mental limitations. They're limits of your mind. Whenever your mind ends up dividing up reality and placing things into separate categories, it's naturally limiting itself. But this category, I'm going to include a lot more. So, fear of inadequacy, fear of other people's opinions, fear of failure or success, or being distracted, or customs, or common sense, or traditional stuff. Anything of that is different ways in which the mind is being limited. And there's also limits, I would say, within the artistic medium as well, too, there. So, there could be limits in technique and limits in theory and different forms of knowledge of whatever you end up doing there. And to sort of put these ideas into a little more clear context, I'm going to use an example. I'm going to use the guitar, mainly because I love playing guitar. So I'm going to talk about that to put some of these ideas into something concrete. So the limits of the artistic medium. Let's just look at that briefly. And we'll include the bodily limitations within that as well too in a moment here. But the thing is that the guitar, it only has so many frets. It only has so many strings. And the amount of vibrations that it can end up producing is relatively small in comparison to the whole spectrum of musical instruments. It's a very, very small fragment. There's only a limited amount of sounds that it can end up generating. Another physical limitation within the context of playing this instrument is that your fingers can only move so fast, and they can only stretch so far, and the dexterity of your hand can only be so refined. there are limits within your body trying to approach the instrument, and there's also going to be limits within the instrument itself. There's only a certain amount of vibrations that the whole instrument can end up producing. Now, the mental limitations when it comes to playing guitar is, first of all, your way of organizing the instrument, what notes you end up tuning the strings up to, how you end up making sense of music theory. What Western music has done has taken the potentially infinite amount of vibrations and divided this into 12 different notes. And it's the various relationships that we end up seeing within these 12 notes that ends up getting the entire span of music theory, as we end up relating all of these notes together, and this is where these advanced systems of music theory stem from. You can have limitations of ideas like technique and your knowledge of the instrument, where the notes are going to be located across the neck of the guitar, and certain ways in which chord patterns are, or scales, or arpeggios, and the techniques like hammer-ons and pull-offs and slides, and so on and so forth. There's so many different ways in which the mind can end up organizing in its experience on the instrument. And there's a certain degree of freedom that you end up getting from these limits. I think that one of the greatest ways in which people end up perceiving the idea of limits is that it's inherently bad, as if limitations are something that we need to try to get rid of as much as possible, to have a position of absolute freedom where there's absolutely no limitations whatsoever, and I think that's absolutely absurd. I think that you can't even have freedom unless there's a certain degree of limitations, because it's just too much information that you have to end up taking into consideration. I'm kind of glad that the visual and the auditory spectrum that we have in our bodies is a small fragment of the available information out there, because think how crazy it would be if you were capable of seeing the entire spectrum of all of those vibrations. It'd be way too much information to handle. Nothing would be very meaningful. You'd just be completely just overwhelmed. There's just too much data to calculate and process, and you wouldn't be able to do anything. You'd be almost in a state of paralysis because there's just too much information. So by limiting it, by reducing it down to something a little more simplistic in a sense, it gives you the ability to express yourself freely through that. It's by recognizing these limitations that you end up acquiring a certain degree of freedom and artistic self-expression. And when it comes to reaching your limits, I think it's very important to not mistake physical limitations for your mental limitations. And this is a very common mistake many people end up making. And just to give an example, say that you're trying to learn a song on guitar. Maybe it's a rather complex song. Maybe you're trying to learn a piece from Mozart or something like that. And you end up picking it up and you end up trying to figure out how the phrasings and how to put your fingers and how to use the patterns to end up performing this song. And let's just say, for example, you're having a tremendous degree of difficulty attempting to figure this thing out. And inevitably you end up getting to the point where you're like, I can't get this at all. It's way outside of my realm of capability. And you end up blaming your body of not being able to handle the complexities of the song. Maybe you might be saying that your fingers are they're too clumsy. They're inadequate for dealing with the nuances of this tune. Your body's just too stupid to be able to pull it off. But this might be an example of a mental limitation that you're actually fighting against. Maybe your body's perfectly capable of playing this song, but your technique may be completely off. Maybe you're using the wrong fingers to end up getting to the notes. Maybe the way in which you're emphasizing perhaps maybe your pointer finger or middle finger, whereas your third finger and fourth finger, which is your ring finger and pinky finger, should have been used for a certain part that would allow you to be in position for the next part of the song. And maybe it was your whole approach to it that ended up needing adjustment. And if you were to mentally adjust yourself to a better technique, or understanding the theories underlying what's going on within that song, then perhaps you very well could end up executing that song. But it wasn't your body that ended up preventing you from executing the song. It was your mind. It was your mental limitations. So maybe in that example, you need to approach your knowledge and end up refining your mind, pushing your mind to reach the extent of its limitations, versus thinking that was your body's fault. Now there may be situations where the opposite may be true, where all of a sudden you may end up understanding perfectly well what needs to be done with the song. Maybe your ideas are perfectly harmonious, your fingering for the various sections of it are as best as they can ever end up being there, and you know the theories underlying each of the different progressions, and you fully understand what needs to be done in order to execute the song. And not just say your body is just incapable at that specific point in time to accommodate itself to the mind. Maybe it just doesn't have that degree of dexterity, or just simply can't move that fast at this point, or stretch that far, or any number of things to be able to execute the mental ideas that you end up having. But it's so often the case in which we'll end up blaming it on our lack of understanding, saying that that we just don't know what we're doing, that ends up preventing us from learning that song. So it's really important to be able to see what type of limitation you're currently dealing with. And again, that takes a certain degree of self-knowledge to be able to pull that kind of thing off there. So make sure that you always are approaching your limitations with a good understanding of which one in particular you're trying to strive for. And I think that if you keep pushing yourself, if you keep allowing yourself to sort of fall down and crash and burn, so to speak, or fall off the horse, or whatever little saying that you want to implement, it requires a certain degree of dusting yourself off and getting back up again. And I think that if you look at anybody who has acquired a certain degree of proficiency within their field, whether it be a musician or an artist, or maybe even somebody like a physicist or a doctor or anything of that sort, it seems as though that if you ever want to reach or unravel, I should say, the depth of your potential or the extent of what your limits are, you have to approach it with that no fear type mentality. You have to love falling off and getting back up. This type of situation should bring a certain degree of elation. It should be fun. You should be loving the fact that this is what's happening, because if something was just too easy, it'd just be boring anyways. So you have to approach it with the attitude of the toddler, learning how to walk, or learning how to eat food with a spoon or something like that. They're not self-conscious about whenever they make a mistake, or whenever they trip and fall or anything like that, and they just get right back up and they giggle and they go off and try it again. There's no sense of inhibition. There's no sense of fear, no anxiety about what other people think or anything like that. But they push themselves. And that's where you end up seeing remarkable degrees of growth and development and refinement. And it's all based upon that type of attitude. So if you want to find your limits, push yourself to them, but do so with the self-knowledge of knowing that you're dealing with either physical or mental limitations.